Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of MLOps Coffee Sessions. I'm here with Dimitrios. How you doing, Dimitrios?
What's happening, everybody? I'm stoked for this session. It is been a long time coming. Shreya, what is going on? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Super excited to be here. More excited than I'd usually be at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. So,
Oh, Pacific time. Yeah, I mean, Dimitrios kind of gave away the goat here, but we have a very special guest. A lot of people in the community, a lot of you listeners have been asking for her to come on. We've been trying our best, and we finally got on her justifiably busy calendar. We have Shreya Shankar joining us. Again, thank you so much for joining us.
thanks for having me. I'm excited.
And so today there's a lot to cover. You're extremely prolific, have had a lot of interesting experiences. What we'd love to do is kind of just go through your career, talk a little bit about what it is that you do as a creator and as a sort of thinker on ML ops and ML systems, and then talk a little bit about what some aspects of ML systems that you've been really excited are. And to kind of kick things off, I can do a little intro, but I feel like I would love for you to intro yourself because there's so much to cover, and I'm curious to hear how you'd put it to our listeners.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm currently a PhD student in databases in the RISE lab at UC Berkeley. And what that means is I'm paid to think full time. It's an excellent job. Would highly recommend it. The pay
Wow.
cut is quite something, but once you get used to that, I think it's really nice to be able to sit down and think about problems that you're interested in. In previous lives, I was a ML engineer at early stage startup. We grew the team from like 4 to 25, and I got to see a lot of like AI saviorism breakdowns in that process, and learn a lot, not just about machine learning, but spinning up infrastructure to enable a team to effectively collaborate on ML, both data science side and product side. Very cool stuff. And then before that, I was at Stanford and Google Brain. I did research in deep learning robustness, very fancy terms for can we inject inputs into deep learning models to break their classification procedure as we know it. Yeah, I feel like I've just been on a fun trajectory of following my interests.
And
And now here I
can
am
I
today.
just mention one thing that when Shreya came into the community, I think I hadn't like seen you online or interacted with you at all on Twitter. And I remember first seeing one of your posts and then being like, whoa, this is really good. This is cool. Would you want to like come on the podcast or something? And you were so humble. You were like, yeah, I don't know if I have anything interesting to say or whatnot. And then come to find out, like every great paper that I've read and that's got a lot of traction, your name is like at the bottom, like, thanks for Shreya for like proofreading this or whatever. And
That's
so
so true.
Funny.
so then I realized like, oh wow, yeah. So yeah, you're pretty humble. You've done some incredible stuff, and I want to get into all of it now. But I think Vishnu
Thank you.
had the first thing he wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I got first dibs. I tried my best to prepare for this session. So you took us through where you've been, some really great names, places, experiences. And the first thing I'd like to kind of start off by asking about is you have been at both large institutions, notably Google Brain, and have sort of seen massive infrastructure at scale that many of the people maybe in the community haven't quite experienced with. But you've also had the really interesting contrast of being at an early stage startup. If I recall correctly, you went from 4 to 25. How has that contrast in scale and systems influenced your perspective on ML ops? What has it taught you about where we're at with ML systems right now?
Yeah, okay, this is a good question. I'd like to say there's two classes of problems here. One is in organizational and people management, people processes. How do you get different types of stakeholders to collaborate together on ML projects? And the other one is purely the resource and the systems perspective of do we have the GPUs to train? Do we have the job scheduling system to make sure everybody is able to meet their SLAs for whatever job that they want to do? And I would say that with modern day infrastructure, actually, it's pretty easy to set up the second class. It's pretty easy to set up a Kubernetes cluster or a cloud cluster. I can set up a Spark cluster. You can figure out how to do this even if you don't know how to. I think there's great resources out there. The thing that I think is super lacking, and rightfully so, because it's a really hard problem, is the whole collaboration piece. It's like, what do we work on? How do we align that everyone's working on the same thing? I think Google has like nailed down how to build product, how to incorporate ML into product. They have created ladders within ladders for themselves for everyone to be motivated to build things, and that's just not something that we see like in any system or tool that, I don't know, your average startup has.
Okay, so I have to go deeper there. So you said you feel like Google has really figured something out when it comes to embedding ML and building machine learning inspired or infused products. What is it about that? Is it culture? Is it tooling? Is it people? What is it that makes Google special, and what can other companies do to replicate that?
Oh man, I don't want to say this is good. I don't know how I feel about it, but I feel like there's this well-known concept of like, I as a researcher within Google Brain, if I figured out how to incorporate some aspect of some project into an existing product, for example, YouTube, an adversarial example, I don't know, whatever, then I can get a promo. And when now, like, when it's laid out like this, right, like all of a sudden nobody's really asking the question of like, do we need this, how do we get this going? It's like everyone is driven to kind of inject ML into everything that they can, in the simplest way possible. And I also think that this is standardized, like the need for data management solutions like TFX within Google, because you want to improve everything is about improving developer productivity, right? Like, you want to make it really easy for people to get their promos. Now we'll build tooling like this. In the case of like in small companies, like for example, the startup that I was at previously, like we never did performance reviews. I don't know if they were like individual. It wasn't clear how to climb the individual ladder, and I don't think this is specific to my startup. I think this is pretty general, right? It's like people are great and motivated, but at the end of the day, if they don't have personal incentives to, like, I don't know, write this paper or make this product work, right? Like, then it's going to be really hard to make that happen, especially at scale.
Interesting. So your perspective, and tell me if I'm summarizing this correctly, is that the combination of sort of management structure and personal or professional incentive at Google really enables them to push out these kinds of products really easily.
I think so. And there is something to be said about like they have awesome infrastructure, right? They have like Borg, they have their own hardware, specialized hardware. But like, if startups invested in this stuff, like if they invested in having like a team to build a cluster on AWS, right? Like, I don't know if the problem is that we don't have great TPUs or great access to like specialized hardware when we think about applied ML at startups. I feel like the problem is, how do we build products that derive value, and then how do we incentivize our engineers and data scientists to build that?
Well, I think there's a bigger question there around what we try and talk about quite a bit, and it's not just like the technical side of MLOps. It is very much like this organizational side. And so what I'm hearing is like, you really want to give like the easiest path to get something working with someone. Like if you have a data scientist or an ML engineer and they have a project that they want to try and implement, it's like, do not block them in any way, shape, or form. Let them see if that works, and then let's reassess afterwards. I imagine there's probably retros all the time to see like,
Yeah.
is it worth us having this in place?
Oh, for sure. We did retros all the time at but we really included them like 6 months into my job at the startup, and that really changed things. And it also really changed things when we reframed the OKRs as like any infra project. The goal of that was either to cut AWS costs or to improve developer productivity. There's no other goal that we cared about. That seriously helped us focus on, I would say, closer to the right things.
And this was at Viaduct that you reframed those OKRs in that way?
Yeah, this was at
Fascinating.
Viaduct. Like, for example, like we had a huge speed up in like our feature computation. We had our own version of a feature store, and there was a cron job to refresh the features. Like that was framed as a developer productivity problem. Like if something was stale and a data scientist noticed, it would take 4 hours to refresh all of the, I don't know, tens of thousands of features. That's like completely unacceptable.
When you were going through and deciding like, oh, do we need this feature store or do we need whatever insert X tool here? How were you looking at like bringing on these tools and deciding the pros and cons of it? And not only that, but like how much resources are we going to need to implement this? I imagine you weren't just going out and getting open source stuff. You were probably building it or rolling your own.
Yeah.
So that adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, for sure. I personally did a lot of stuff. We did a lot of stuff in house. I think this is also another incentives problem. The time that it takes for me to go back and forth, try out a bunch of tools, and decide on the best tool and convince everyone. Like, for example, Airflow versus Argo versus Kubeflow versus Prefect, right? Like, this is something that companies will spend 4 months trying
Oh my
to figure
God,
out the right
yes.
one. And 4 months might be an understatement. I don't even know.
Yeah.
At some larger organizations, right, there's an organizational process for this, and like you get your promo or like part of your job is recognized as like figuring out the tool and getting all the stakeholders on board and making that sales cycle happen. If you're at a startup where there's like less than 10 people, like nobody is rewarding you for that sales cycle. They'll reward you for having something working. And that kind of motivated me to build a lot of stuff in-house. There are a few things that we used that were not like, things that people had used before, like Prometheus, Grafana, like just the existing ELK stack, stuff like that. But nothing like no paid service for sure was even in the cards until we had about like 15, 16 people.
Yeah, it's having worked a lot at startups, I really appreciate the way that you're summarizing the issue, which is almost that at startups there's such a pressure to run and not
Yeah.
as much to stop and think, and there's such a lack of clarity around product and process. So it makes it almost difficult to have the kind of like structured rational investment over time that you need, to realize these kinds of, leaps in improvement, that something like, thinking about improving developer productivity, something like,
sure.
what you said there. It leads
I
me
think
to an
there's
interesting
also
question. Go ahead.
Go for it. No, I think there's another point that I wanted to mention, which was a lot of companies don't even know what they want to build, right? Because there's no concept of product market fit, and they think that they want to throw. A lot of academic companies have this problem. They want to throw deep learning at X, and only a year later do they realize that they'd never wanted to do that. I'm guilty of this, right? I came from Stanford AI Lab. And in that process, if you don't have that kind of clarity, right, of what you're building, then it's really hard to invest in the right things, as you said, that have the long-term payoff.
Completely agree with what you're saying. How did you enjoy working at a startup?
I really liked that I learned a lot.
Okay.
I'm not sure that I would go and be an early engineer at a startup again.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but I learned a lot, and I think I was in the right place at the right time, and I am very grateful for that, for sure.
That equity, the promise of billions later on down the line is not worth it, huh? Not worth all that stress.
Oh, no way. I don't make any money now, so you can.
Oh,
The ramen budget. So
Yeah.
So the reason I asked that question about working at a startup is because I see now that you're an entrepreneur in residence at Amplify Partners. Congratulations. We had Sarah join our podcast a few months ago, one of our favorite firms, very interesting portfolio. What are you up to there, and how does that dovetail with your academic work and your entrepreneurial ambitions?
Yeah, for sure. I kind of joined it very transitionary. I don't even know if it's a word. I left my company and I went to Amplify for a few months to talk to other data portfolio companies. I personally think that they have the most impressive portfolio when it comes to data tooling companies.
Completely agree.
And Sarah's absolutely phenomenal and has a really great grasp on kind of where the industry is. I wouldn't say that I want to start a company now. I'm not the kind of person who like wants to be an entrepreneur. I think like I always find problems that I'm interested in, and if starting a company happens to be the best vehicle to solve it, then so be it. If going to a PhD program is the best vehicle to solve, I don't know. Like I'm super now, unfortunately, interested in ML monitoring, which we can get in later. Um, yeah, then it really just depends, I think, on the problem and the time and the place and the market and all of these things.
I like how you say that. The unfortunately interested in ML monitoring. And I'm sure so many people can relate to you with that one, because if they've looked at like the tooling sprawl, they're like, oh my God, there's so many different monitoring tools out there. And what makes these monitoring tools better than just that Prometheus and Grafana that you talked about earlier?
Well, read
So
my latest blog post on how I really cry that Prometheus doesn't scale for anything that we care about in ML. But anyways,
Well, I think this is a perfect transition for us to kind of start to get into that, right? Talking about why you're interested
yeah,
in ML monitoring, observability. Maybe tell us how you got interested in this problem.
yeah. I think uh, after you spend over a year building feature stores and experiment tracking tools and monitoring dashboards on what's it called, Metabase, then you think like, man, why isn't this a job that's like, what is this and why is everyone doing this? And uh, I don't know. I think having built all these things from scratch from Spark, uh, really motivated me to wonder, like, can I not do this? This is really annoying, and are other people having this problem? Yeah, so that happened, and then I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, I was not really incentivized to solve these problems at my company because the primary goal, right, is to get some product market fit, and we weren't an MLOps company. We were an applied ML company. Um, and yeah, that's kind of what got me into it.
That makes sense. I sort of have a big picture question about this whole overall ML observability field and your perspective on it. A lot of people have come to me recently, for whatever reason, maybe it's because I host a podcast, and said, what is it with all this monitoring stuff? There's so many companies out there. I know that I probably should do it, bake it into my ML system, but I'm not really sure how to. It seems like a
Yeah,
pretty simple thing initially. Maybe it gets more complicated. I don't know what to do. Right?
yeah,
That's some sort of summary of what I hear a lot. What do you have to say to that person
yeah.
about how the landscape looks and what advice you would give them in terms of where to get started?
Yeah, so at the risk of sounding like a tech bro, I will say I'm a first principles person. And I think our industry is very good at taking waves, movements in software engineering and applying them to ML and data science. So, for example, there was an observability movement in software, and we have decided, rightfully so, that observability is a movement that should happen in machine learning, especially post deployment. But we haven't figured out how to go one step deeper into this. And this is like my latest series of blog posts. Next paper, hopefully, I don't know where it'll be. But the first question then is, what is the first thing that people monitor, right? And that's where everyone is getting it wrong. We shouldn't be monitoring KL divergences for tens of thousands of features. That doesn't make any sense. We should be monitoring the SLOs as we do in software, the SLIs. What are they in ML? A lot of software people don't already know them off the top of their head, which makes sense because we think about things like precision and recall and more complex aggregations that are joins over multiple data sources, right? So now how do we build a monitoring tool that can at any point in time give me my real-time accuracy or real-time precision? And this is already a hard problem, right? Because we have things like label lag, we have imperfect joins. It depends on how our monitoring is done in streaming systems. We lose data if we're in Windows. It's unclear that like windowed precision, right, over the last 90 days is like a metric that maps to business value. So I think the first set of meetings to have at your company is, right? Like, what is the real-time metric that we need to monitor that provides business value? Specify the window size, specify the metric function or functions. I know so many people who like are monitoring every like precision recall, F1, FPR, TPR, like 15 metrics are being monitored over like 10 sliding windows, and it's like, wow, like that's 150 numbers that are on a chart. Tell, like, what do I do with this? But yeah, once you can distill that into a number, then you get the second order question of, all right, when that SLI is changing, why is it going down? Which then it's like, I care about data drift, I care about feature drift, I care about all of these other things as a means for debugging why my primary service level indicator is going down, if that makes any sense. So
So it's like
that's kind of what I would
one
recommend.
metric to rule them all then.
Oh, yeah, one metric to rule them all that actually makes sense to everyone. And then all the other metrics as a means for figuring out why that one metric to rule them all is not high.
So this is a very different perspective on monitoring than anything I've heard before. Let me start by saying that.
Yeah.
What led you to this realization? Is there a specific story, maybe from your time at Viaduct or some kind of business outcome you were trying to do? Like, what led you here?
Yeah, so I didn't realize it while I was at Viaduct. I think in hindsight, I could have realized it when I was at Viaduct because we had all these CloudWatch alerts set on every possible aggregation of columns you could have in the feature table. And nobody was looking at these CloudWatch. I remember getting all the alerts and then just doing delete, 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 delete in my inbox, right? Like that's already the first sign. I didn't realize it at the time, but whatever, now I know. And the thing that we actually really, everyone in the company, including the clients, looked at was our Metabase dashboard of recall for a specific problem computed daily. So we computed like a rolling. So the way that we phrased the problem was we're deploying our model. It wasn't a model. It was like a continuous retraining, whatever it is. We're deploying it on October 1st. And at any given point in time on the graph, you're going to see the cumulative recall until that day. And this was something that everyone understood, and they understood how it mapped to ROI. Everyone looked at this dashboard every day for all stakeholders. And I think that's like super telling, right? That's the thing that people care about. That's the thing that people care about. And then of course we saw like when this graph decreased, then I would go into the CloudWatch alerts. And this is something I don't actually know how to articulate well, so I'm still thinking about it. But I didn't know how to make sense of the alerts. Like, for example, let's say your P90 changes for some feature that's like not even important. I don't even know what to do with that. So what I usually did was just retrain the model on a latest window and hope that worked. And if it didn't work, then I was like, all right, then probably there's some data corruption, some, I don't know, like some engineering problem. But yeah, so I think that kind of, I didn't think about it too much at the time, but as I talked to a bunch of people, especially people who are interested in mltrace, and they were like, yeah, like, I don't know when to retrain my model. This question comes up a lot. I think it's like I don't know when to retrain my model, or I accept that when I deploy my model, I immediately get a 10% performance hit, and then I kind of just like wait and see until someone complains and then look at it again, right? There's no like kind of standardized on-call process, at least at these smaller companies, at like a non-Netflix, right?
Can I just say, like,
So, yeah.
I love that you're calling that out because I generally, whenever I talk to someone, especially if it has to do anything with monitoring, one of my go-to questions is how do you prevent alert fatigue? And it sounds like you were really talking about that. And so this, I don't even know if Vishnu knows this, but back in the day, almost over a year ago, I was working for this company called Instana. And I just did like a month there. And when I was there, I remember one day, like internally on Slack, somebody said, did you know that Instana has been able to decrease alert fatigue with its own AI ops that because it uses AI, which they were calling AI, not machine learning, on the monitoring system that it uses. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. And then I always like think it's it's like meme worthy, but it's like, wow, could we use some kind of model on our monitoring to make sure that we know
Oh
what the
no.
important things to monitor are? Like I just see the pimp my ride meme where it's like, hey dog, I heard you like ML. We put some ML in your ML. And so so anyway, the thing here that you're talking about, it makes a lot of sense. It's like, well, you don't even need to over engineer it with all this ML talk on your ML. Just like find that important metric. And I know that Lena, almost a year ago, like in June 2020, she came on and talked about how it's like, yeah, make sure that you have a metric, and then make sure you have like the plus or minus for it, you know, like the low and the high, and let it just oscillate in between there. And if it goes way crazy, then you should be notified, and then you can dig deeper. So I really like that philosophy of like, find one, make that be your like heartbeat. And then if you really want to dig into stuff, you have everything else there.
Yeah.
So I don't know if, yeah, go ahead.
No, it's the simplest things, you know, like I see a lot of off-the-shelf monitoring tools too that I've been looking at recently, and I'm like, I this is a personal thing. I get fatigued just looking at some of these dashboards. I can only look at one graph, one time series, maybe few labels to segment into, but that's it. I cannot look at like 100 graphs on. I'm not even exaggerating when I say 100 with some of these.
Well,
Yeah, but
that
that's
and
very
that kind
personal.
of it goes into one of the questions that I wanted to ask on this is like, as I imagine you've been diving deep into the current landscape of what's out there. And so where do you feel like they're getting it right, and where do you feel like they're getting it wrong? Have you seen anyone that is tackling the problem like this? You don't even have to mention any names, just like a yes or a no.
I have not seen anyone tackling the problem like this, and I've seen a few dashboards and demos, but I'm sure like things are gonna change. They change every day, so
Yeah.
I'm sure
And
eventually they will.
I should give a subtle plug that if anybody wants to get fatigued by all the monitoring solutions that are out there, we've got a page on the MLOps community where you can compare all of the tools and you can see what their UI looks like, and you can go as crazy as you want. But anyway, I saw Vishnu wanted to say something, so I'll let you go, Vishnu.
Well, I think that your thorough description of the problem really resonated with me. A dashboard, a sort of like of machine learning metrics that nobody really looks at model release to model release, because there's too much sort of like noise there, right? You know, and instead a business related dashboard, you know, at our RCM company, we look at healthcare book jargon, blah blah blah. We look at a notion of direct to bill, right? Which is like, how are we doing on this like translatable business outcome? And if that direct to bill drops week over week or month over month, we're like, oh my god, you know, check what's going on. And then
Yeah.
we go through this extensive process of having to look through, you know, hundreds of different clients, then look through all of the different reports for those clients and have to deal with a lot of business process related things. For example, if, you know, a fax machine in a doctor's office somewhere isn't working properly, that affects our outcome, right? Because we have to interact with those business processes. So what I'm trying to illustrate there is, I get what you're saying, and I totally see how this monitoring, what we have right now of this almost like solution-oriented monitoring, needs to become much more problem-oriented. My question to you is, how can, and I'm not saying you have to come up with this right now, but how can tooling bridge that gap? And do you have any sort of like mental models or examples in other realms that you would like to see applied to monitoring?
Yeah. Okay, this is a great question. The short answer is you should read my latest 3 blog posts and the next one.
I really should.
The long answer, okay. So part of the reason I got into databases is because a lot of these data management problems are just, you have data living in different sources being updated at different times, but I need to compute some view that includes all of them. And if you frame monitoring tools like this, right, like, which is, what do I join? How do I join this efficiently over what windows? What are the views to materialize, right, to use the database terminology? I think you can kind of abstract away a lot of the the issues or build a more general purpose solution. And let me give you an example, right, on label lag. Suppose I'm Netflix, and I am outputting recommendations, the movies that I want you to watch. I have one pipeline to do that, and then probably a separate pipeline to collect feedback on how users interact with these recommendations. And right, there's like a lag somehow in between these two pipelines coming in, and then of course, like maybe there's a join key or whatever you want to terminology you want to use, an identifier that links them. The problem is, I sometimes for predictions I make, I might not have labels, but I still want to know my real time SLI, right? And how do I do that, right? Like, how do I compute the confidence interval at any given point in time? Like, I know I've made 100 predictions and only 80 of them have labels. And then how do I weight this, right, by subgroup, which is like my users in North America versus my users in Europe, South America, whatnot, right? Like, how do I get the fine-grained going back to what Demetrios said, right? Like, what is the one metric to rule them all that is reliable, that I can trust, and deals with the problems that we face in the real world, which is disparate data sources, lag, everything.
The thing that I've been meditating a lot on lately, and I mentioned this in the Year in Review podcast and have mentioned it in a number of podcasts, has just been that, part of the reason I think that we're at this juncture in this overall MLOps ecosystem and with the tooling that we're at is just that, like me, a lot of people who get into machine learning engineering and data science are just not that familiar with state-of-the-art data technologies and have not been in environments that require it, right? Don't grow up with that. It's why actually I think that a lot of people who start off in an analyst role, who started in an analyst role a couple of years ago and have kind of progressed along that track, are much more fluent in the kinds of questions and answers that we're talking about than your data scientist and machine learning engineer. It's been a really interesting, sort of like educational difference for me to have to grapple with personally. And I'm on that journey now in terms of how to sort of learn these sort of gaps.
It's definitely hard.
And can I just highlight something real fast? I thought what you said, Shreya, around like a lot of these problems are coming from the database level, where it's like things are coming into the database at different times. And then you're trying to have this view and you're trying to take out insights, but you're missing different pieces. I feel like you're trying to put a puzzle together, but how can you put the puzzle together when half of the puzzle is being shipped to you in the moment you're trying to put it together and it's en route, right? So it hasn't even arrived yet you're trying to
I'm gonna steal it.
I've been making a lot of puzzles over the holiday breaks with my daughter, and that's what I got for Christmas. So lots of Frozen puzzles, actually. So I could tell you all about Frozen, but that's a whole nother conversation. Anyway, I think that's just something really interesting to highlight. Like, wow, this database is where you might want to look to try and solve some of these major issues. So I'm wondering, like, in that, how can we solve it? Is it just that we need to make a bigger window? Is it that we need to like recognize things are going to lag so we can like just plan for that ahead of time? How do you see that being solved?
Again, long answer, read the blog posts. The fourth one will come out where I discuss this problem in particular. But yeah, I just envision a solution where the DBMS is doing the monitoring. Like, we just have like a monitoring DBMS where it's a very Prometheus style interface in which you log outputs and you log the identifiers. You log outputs and you log feedback or labels. And of course you log the identifiers, and then I will do the materialized view, the incremental view maintenance basically under the hood, and then give you the confidence intervals based on kind of what labels exist and what don't. I don't know. I haven't thought too deeply about it, but I imagine that this is very possible.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it squares with one of the most important blog posts that I come back to, which is Benedict Evans' ML is the New SQL blog post. Basically, in that he's like, right now, machine learning is this sort of arcane way of thinking about how to go from data to insights, and eventually it's just going to look a lot like SQL. There's going to be a lot of people, and if we think about it from like a SQL style interface, right, which is just like it's almost English, right? It's a pretty intuitive sort of interface for working with data. What are the technologies that are getting us there? And I think your perspective is a lot of this will happen in the databases, in the data warehouses, in that technology almost abstracted away natively. Is that correct?
Yeah, 100%. And the other thing is like we keep oscillating in tech between unbundling and bundling, and
Yep.
I wouldn't fall too much in the trap of like a paid service, like a software as monitoring as a service sort of thing. Like, I just don't think that's gonna fly for a lot of different companies. Maybe for some, but
Don't tell that to
Bank
our
of America
sponsors.
isn't gonna. Bank of America is, well, I mean, I'm sure they already
I'm
know it.
joking.
So
No, I
But
think.
go ahead, Vishnu.
No, you go ahead, Demetrius.
I can't remember what I was going to say now. I was joking around too much and I lost my train of thought. But yeah, I think it was more around like, okay, so you have the monitoring on the database side or the data warehouse side, but then like what about the model monitoring? Does that just become like lower level and you have that heartbeat or that one metric to rule them all, and that's just something that you dig into when you're looking at the model?
yeah, that I really think that's going to be the latter, especially as you have like chains of models when you have embedderings powering downstream models, right? No, everyone's last ditch resort is to go and investigate the model, right? If you can fix a problem without touching the model, that is like gold. Um, I think it makes much more sense from a business perspective to monitor pipelines and not individual models.
That makes perfect sense. And I realize now that we have not even asked you, amongst all of this interesting discussion, about mltrace, which is your project that addresses some of these questions. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it fits into this?
Yeah. So my goal is to kind of build that into an open source observability tool. I've kind of just been playing around with things that I could get off the. There's some things that I know that I will always need for debugging purposes. For example, like end-to-end traces. Like, so I already have that kind of tracing functionality in there. But the goal was kind of to spend this year thinking about like what is like a actual value proposition that I can deliver to people. I think that is around monitoring somehow, and how do I do this in very open source, like clean format. I think ML Flow is a wonderful example of a very simple, easy to use open source technology. um, and I'm sure there's an equivalent for that in the observability. I have a slide on like there's 3 classes of data management for ML. One is pre-training, like feature stores, ETL, all of that. One is experiment tracking, which is like how do I choose the best model, and then the last is everything after deploying the model, sort of thing. Um, and nobody's really made a big dent, I think, in the observability or the last space, but we've got a lot of awesome players in the first 2. So yeah, that's just kind of what I've been thinking about.
I like that framework because I think it also illustrates, especially on that first 2 where you said there are a lot of solutions, but there are a lot of sort of like going back to what I said about the human capital element of this. That's also where you see a lot of fracturing, right? Part 1, pre-training, is often the province of a data platform team or a data-oriented team, and part 2 is this data science team, and there, that disconnect, which we talk a lot about on the podcast, is a core issue for why some of these problems in terms of not having the data you need to solve the monitoring problems exist. That's at least been my experience.
Yeah.
So with all this discussion about mltrace and monitoring, you've mentioned that you've written a blog post series on it, and I've taken a look at it. It's awesome. I need to read it more thoroughly, clearly.
It's
But
super in-depth and technical, and I like deeply apologize for anybody who has to read it, but I don't know, I think it's important, so I wrote it.
but that's the best part of your content, and that's what we love, and that's why so many people in our community and in our listening base were asking for you to join us on this session is because your content is technical, it's thoughtful, and it's different from all the
Appreciate that.
sort of general content that we see on Medium or anywhere else, which is important,
Yeah.
but yours is differentiated. And I kind of wanted to start by asking, what drives you to create in that vein?
Yeah, maybe this is a more personal question. I've always loved writing, like ever since I was younger. I've always like journaled. I'm part of like a weekly writers group. And I try to write like fiction and other things. I'm very bad at it. I took writing classes in college. It's just a personal hobby, and I think uh, it helps with communication in a way. And I find that I make progress on problems when I'm able to write about it. So, for example, this whole monitoring thing, I think it was stewing in my head for several months, and I just didn't know how to make progress on it. So, writing has definitely helped in that way. Um, I a lot of times I wish I know I've publicly spoken about it, which is like I really could not write anything in 2021, or I couldn't publish anything in 2021. It was very hard for me. I spent a lot of time writing things. I have a lot of unfinished drafts. But I I don't know. I guess it's just my style of writing that doesn't enable me to post things when I write them. I will say that for every 10 things I write, like 8 of them don't go out. And it's really
Oh, wow.
frustrating. It sucks. It really does suck. There's no
Yeah.
way around that. Yeah, I guess maybe that gives you more insight into my process. I don't know. Yeah, it is not what it seems. That's what I wanted to convey.
I think that's really, really important to hear. I also self-identify as a writer. I actually publish on a pseudonymous blog that nobody reads because
Oh,
it's
that's
just about the
awesome.
writing. It's not about people reading it. It's just about the writing. And
Yeah.
there's actually a quote from Oliver Sacks, who is a sort of physician author, that I thought was really cool, where he was like, writing is a form of self-talk for me. It is a form of thinking that is just a different format, right? It's not all stuck up here, and the words that come out help clarify what you're thinking. And it seems like that's
For
the
sure.
same way that you approach it. A lot of people in our community are, creators, and you mentioned some of the things about how the process is not what the outcome tends to look like, right? Like there's a difference there. What other
Yeah.
tips would you have for people who are looking to try to write more, maybe publish more, and kind of try and get their perspective out for others to consume and learn from?
I think it's really important to have some sort of goal. And it's totally fine and cool if that goal is like, I want to grow my personal brand, but I think it just helps to articulate it and not lie to yourself about that. And with that being said, I also think that there's two styles then of trying to achieve that goal. One is like for me, I think like, okay, if I have something that I want to last forever, like is more timeless, like for example, a discourse on ML monitor, or kind of like rethinking the whole ML monitoring, I want it to last for a very long time. That's something I consider a blog post. If it's like a 21 trends in 2020, I don't know how to write these things, but I imagine I see a lot of them. If I could write them, right, like I imagine that's a Twitter thread. Um, and I think it helps to like delineate like what goes to Twitter and what goes to the blog. Like for me, what goes to Twitter is I'm in bed writing it. That goes to Twitter. If it's part of my agenda of like I want to make progress on a problem I'm thinking about, that goes to the blog post. Yeah, with that lens, it's significantly easier. I'll also say like lowering the bar in terms of output definitely helps. Like for me, I just accept that I will write something and it probably will not get out there. Just that's how the numbers have worked historically for me, unfortunately. It also really helps to have like really good editors. I feel very, very blessed to have good editors who will just tell me like, yeah, so I read it and then I haven't really thought about it since I read it 2 days ago. And you don't want to put something out there that people aren't thinking about for two
Wow.
days. And it's like, that's fair. I spent 1 week on this, but ultimately he's right. It
Wow.
helps to have really brutally honest friends that do that.
Yes.
And I try to do that
Yes.
for other people too, for sure. But
That's why I'm trying to
it
get you
helps.
to help me edit the
I
next
saw,
blog
I
post
saw.
that I'm putting out.
You give me a deadline
So
and I'll put it on my calendar.
yes, I am expecting that kind of brutal honesty from you for the next blog post. But I wanted to I know this is a little bit counterproductive, but I wanted to just jump back to what we were talking about before and ask about like this whole idea of the monitoring or looking at monitoring through the lens of like the database and being on that level. Do you feel like that only works for certain kinds of use cases, or is that something that is a blanket? Because that's one thing that I have a really hard time with when, and hence why I'm trying to write this blog post about it, is around like ML is so diverse, and we call ML it's one thing, but really it's like, let's play a game. Which one is not like the others? Fraud detection, robotics, autonomous vehicles, like all
Yeah.
of these, or computer vision just in general for healthcare or for, none of them are anything like the other. And each one of these has their own specific needs and their own specific like SLAs. And so when I think about certain things, like you mentioned feature stores a lot, and I look at feature stores and it's like, yes, for certain use cases, that's really good and it's very useful. For other use cases, it's kind of like, it hasn't really found its place yet, maybe,
Yeah, and
or
don't try to
it never will.
pigeonhole it. Like 99%
Yeah.
of cases, you can do fine with a Postgres table. Actually, this is not specific to feature stores. I think in life, like in data management, 99% of times you should just use Postgres. But
that's an amazing statement. We may
yeah,
have to
no,
quote
I
you on
haven't
that.
read your post, so I'll comment on it when I read the draft. But I totally hear you. I think on the it feels like a lot of solutions in ML are not generalizable, particularly because you're applying to different domains. Like robotics is a different breed of machine learning development than like your tabular data setting. I think this is the only time you'll hear the VC in me. But the key thing that I learned from Amplify is that it doesn't matter that you're solving everyone's problem. All that matters is you solve a problem that is big enough to make you enough money, or that's how they'll say it, but like, you know, that a problem that is big enough, and it doesn't need to be everyone's problem. You don't even need to have a path to get there. I don't know very much about video. I know a little bit about images. I think video is a very interesting case when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to embedding databases. One thing that's super interesting about being in academia, right, is like you have a lot of researchers that are super interested in like video, and how do you query videos, right? How do you have a database of videos? How do you make all of this efficient? How do you derive insights out of it? And there's very little common thread, I think, between the interfaces of these solutions, or the problems that these solutions are trying to solve. Like the only thing at the end of the day is like everything is a DBMS. That's like the only thing these guys have in common. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it, at least like as long as you find something that's big enough. I think tabular data is a massive problem that's completely under resourced. That in itself, like if you can solve stuff in that area, like I wouldn't worry too much for now. That's the VC.
Excellent.
Okay, now let's go.
Yeah, I like it. Something's worn off on you. So Vishnu wanted to get into a lightning round. I know that. Like, what did you want to do, Vishnu? What do you got for us?
Well, I think you've already given us some hot takes, some very, very spicy hot takes in terms of this monitoring stuff. So maybe we don't need to go there. But one question, just to kind of, throw some stuff back and forth, is like, what advice would you give to people who are trying to pick up machine learning, engineering, ML systems development in 2022? What kinds of things should they focus on that maybe you didn't focus on maybe when you were starting like 2018 or something like that?
Yeah, understand databases, data management, the patterns in that. This is just my view of looking at the problems. Know how to set up a Postgres database. And then once you can get there, once you've gotten this kind of storage layer, what's the layer on top of that? A lot of this is just like scheduling, execution, understand kind of what's out there for like queuing up jobs. How do you think about like giving data scientists the ability to run any job that they want? That's like the next level of questions to try to answer. I don't know any great books, honestly, off the top of my head to recommend. I think there's a lot of small books that are very like designing data intensive applications, right? Like everyone loves that book. And I think there's like some like ML systems design, like Chip is teaching a course on that. I'm not fully aware of the curriculum, but I imagine that like this might be a good venue to kind of look into resources. But yeah, once you can get that like execution layer down, then on top of that, like what do interfaces look like for data scientists to like how do I spin up a Jupyter environment for them? I think my style of ML engineering is very much like enabling data scientists' productivity and ability for people to debug models and
So
software. I hate training models. I'm past that stage in my life. What it
is the
feels like.
database as low down the stack as you feel like you need to go?
I think it's the first thing to learn, just basic data management principles, and then also how that plays in with cloud. Like, for example, I think people don't think about their data management choices until it's too late or when they have multiple clients or tenants. I'm speaking from the experience of working with like a very client-based company, which is like the number of my data migrations that we did was just way too high in the beginning. Like, for example, we'll have one S3 bucket that we just kind of treat as a scratch bucket. And then we have 2 clients, and then we're supposed to have a product. And it's like, okay, we should think about our data architecture all over again. Like maybe it's how do we think about isolation? Maybe it's like one bucket for each client. And then like, how do we think about like, what is the scratch? Like, how do you even think about the file system? I don't know. A lot of these things, right? Like, I think it takes some practice to, or it takes some thought. And I'd recommend people to think about these. I wish there were, these are the kinds of like ML system questions I would absolutely love to ask, but it's neither ML nor system. So an interview, I don't know. I haven't thought too deeply about what the interview question analogy is.
I think that's great advice. My next question is what are you most excited for in 2022?
Is it 2022 this year? Yeah, it's 2022 this year. I'm excited.
That's so real.
Sorry. I'm very excited to go to users that are using my product. I will have like mltrace. I think will be the monitoring first pass will be done probably before around the beginning of like mid Q2 2020 is like my goal. And I'm excited to spend the summer and like fall like really like talking to people about it and like integrating it into people's use case. It's been a while since I got to do like forward deployed engineering, for lack of a better term. It's been a while since I got to do that, and I really enjoy that role personally. So yeah.
I will say the MLOps community is a great place for you to find users and for people to join in helping
for
Shreya
sure.
build out mltrace. So this is it's a plug to you, Shreya, and to all of our listeners.
I appreciate that. I really appreciate that. That's super helpful. And I will say I've gotten some people who are interested from the community who are closing tickets as we speak. So I'm very excited about that.
Awesome. Oh, that's
things
so
get
cool.
big.
I've got one for you. What in the like MLOps space or ecosystem right now, what is something you would like to see change?
Okay. The space is very large. So maybe you define the boundaries. Like, does VC, does funding, like, does that count as part of the space, or is it just like the
if you want to
community
go
of
there,
engineers?
let's go there. Let's do it.
Okay,
If
yeah.
that's where your mind drifts.
Without sugarcoating it, we are in the era of the $100 million seed round. I stole that quote from Benedict Evans. I think it's terrible for innovation. I think it draws out a lot of perverse incentives. People are not incentivized to think critically about problems and solve problems that people actually have. We're also in a point in time where it's more lucrative for an individual ML person to start a company than to solve a problem. And for as long as that's true, like I think it's terrible. And I hope that we can change those incentives.
That is a quote that you gave us a lot of quotes, but that may be the quote of the episode because I actually think that that's so true. It is so true. Going back to what you were saying about being an early stage engineer at a startup, I mean, I have multiple brilliant friends who have basically said, there's no way I'm going to be a founding engineer, an early stage engineer. The equity deal sucks.
Really stupid.
Yeah, they've worked the shit out of you. The equity deal sucks. You get paid less than you're supposed to. And any one of these funding rounds, you get screwed, right? And that's just one, that's sort of like a micro example of the bigger picture issue you're painting, right? Where it's like funding has changed the innovation, the incentives around innovation in a way that's it's not very good right now. I completely agree with
You're
that.
getting the best
So-
engineers on this problem to be full-time fundraisers. That's not something they know how to do, and they're judged by how quickly they can go from Series A to Series B and get their $500 million valuation. That's just
Man.
terrible. I don't
That's
like
some
it.
And
Shreya.
have you talked to Sarah about this?
Yeah, I
sure.
really like to amplify folks because they don't give $100 million seed rounds. They give like under $10 million, which makes even 10 is high. I think that's for Series A. But like a good Series A round should be like $9 to $10 million, and like that seemed massively low in the current day and age, right? From like I will not name the funds that are giving these massive rounds, but they're there
Yeah.
and you see them, and
Yeah,
They're all over
but
the
then
news.
how do you compete? Like me as this company that just raised a $2 million round that seems very small, and then my competitor just raised a $50 million round, like,
Yeah.
and they have
I
endless resources.
I don't know how to compete. I think that's not. I don't have a solution to it. That's why I just ranted about it without any productive. I'm not starting a company. I would not know how to solve it. Like, it's,
Important disclaimer.
Not yet, until
Yeah,
MLtrace
it's-
becomes a huge hit, and then you're gonna have to rethink it, huh?
and then, well, that's different, right? Because then you start a product company after you already have something, right? Like, I'm talking like in the current market, people are starting shells and then thinking about their products. So.
That's a good way to put it. And with that, last question. Why are you training for an Ironman?
Oh. Okay. I grew up competitive swimming, and
Okay.
in college I started doing triathlons, and I've always wanted to do like a cool, crazy event, and I feel like an Ironman is like sounds crazy enough. So I've done a half. I was gonna do a full this year, but I don't know if I have the time because grad school is hard. But definitely next year, if not the end of this year.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I actually just
It's-
saw that you're on Strava, and so I'm gonna follow you on Strava. And
Oh, I haven't done anything this break, so
okay.
don't judge.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Shreya, for joining us. I feel like I learned so much about where machine learning monitoring can go, what kinds of things it makes more sense for ML professionals to focus on as they architect and develop ML systems. And I think most importantly, the importance of problem orientation, right? And how fine I think a balance there is between, what we do day to day, which is very solution oriented, and what the big picture really is about, which is the problem. You really brought a lot of that to this conversation. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.